Thank you all for being here for the Dean's Distinguished Speaker Series. So we have a very exciting a guest that I've been able to interact for the last 4 or 5 years. Every time I meet our guest, I'll tell you who it is. I always come back impressed for his humility, his insights, and just being a wonderful human being who looks after the best of the world. So let me introduce Bill Fishlinger. He's our guest today. He's an exceptional leader in insurance, law, and public service. Bill is co-founder and chief executive officer for Gramercy. I'm pronouncing correct, Gramercy? Gramercy. Risk Holdings, where he built one of the most innovative risk organizations in the country. He has shaped how public sector risk is financed and managed, pioneering partnerships with schools and municipalities, and building WRM America into a national specialty insurance leader. He led one of the largest insurance transactions of 2014 through a consolidation with Brown & Brown. Soon after, he founded Gramercy Risk Holdings, where he serves as chairman and CEO. He's also a respected attorney and a leader of the New York law firm. This is a big name: Congdon, Flaherty, O'Callaghan, Fishlinger, and Pavlidis. Beyond business, Bill is deeply committed to education and medical research, serving as chair of the National Board of the Diabetes Research Institute Foundation and on the board of the University of Maryland Foundation. A proud University of Maryland alumnus, graduate of St. John's University School of Law, and veteran of the United States Air Force, Bill is a recipient of the Insurance Federation of New York Free Enterprise Award. Please join me in welcoming Bill Fishlinger. Bill, thank you for joining us this evening. The way the structure is, we want it to be more interactive. The first about 20 minutes or 25 minutes, I'll ask some questions to get it started. But I want you to be more interactive. And if somebody has an urgent need to ask a question, raise your hand. I don't believe in this too formal of a structure. Let it flow the way it has to. So many of you are students here, and Bill was a student on this campus. So I would like you to take a few minutes to take from being a student here, just like a lot of students here, and your journey to be the founder and CEO of Gramercy Risk Holding.
If you'll, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank all of you for coming. It's a real pleasure. Every time I come back to this campus, I say how lucky I was to have years here, and I had an opportunity to be one of the commencement speakers at some years ago, and I tried to emphasize that. It was a very important part of my life. But if you allow me to maybe move a little earlier than when I was here and how I got here, is maybe we'll tell a little more about who I am. How many people here are from New York? Okay, I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island in a very small town called Seaford. Long before I was there, but after World War II, or prior to World War II, those little villages were fishing villages and farms. Now, if anybody can imagine, that from the east edge of our backyard to the village of Seaford was a little less than 1.5 miles. And it was all farm. One farm. Right? It's hard to imagine that Long Island was that rural. It was an idyllic time to grow up. As a little boy, I had 2 wonderful parents, but from very diverse backgrounds. My father came from abject poverty and was one of the hardest working people I've ever known. My mother, I'm mostly, even my name doesn't sound it, I'm mostly Italian. All my grandparents were immigrants to this country. He came to this country when he was 9, sent here alone to work in a 2-seater barbershop.
Wow.
He married my grandmother when he was 17. He went to rent an apartment in Queens and Hollis, and they wouldn't rent to him because he was Italian. And he went on to build one of the largest homes in Queens for my grandmother. I had the most wonderful mother. and she clearly has been the most influential person in my life. She taught me three things. One, to never be afraid. And then something happened that tested that. So she was diagnosed with terminal cancer when I was 12. And for the first time in my life, I was deathly afraid. She was in a hospital for almost a year, and we were told she would not survive. But she did. And I can tell you exactly where I was in our house in Seaford when I said I'll never be afraid again in my life. She also taught me that nothing's impossible. And that's been a big part of my life, that maybe you'll fail, but nothing's impossible. The third thing she taught me, I'm going to ask the dean to remind me, it'll be the last thing I will leave for you. And it was the most important thing in life. I went on to go to Seaford High School. I was a very mediocre academic student. I was a good wrestler and a pretty good baseball player. And I knew exactly the grade point average you needed to maintain to stay eligible to play sports. And I believe, if I go back and search the records, that's the grade point average I graduated with. My mother also taught me to read 2 books a week that had nothing to do with school. It's been a discipline that I keep to this day. Even when I was building a law firm, had a consulting company, was going to law school. It's a great discipline. But I was a very mediocre academic student in high school. I graduated. I went to Hofstra University because of it was a good wrestling school. But after a year, I realized that my parents weren't rich. They did fine. We didn't want for anything. But they couldn't afford to. I had no purpose for being there other than to wrestle. That's like a stupid thing. So I decided I was going to drop out of college. But it was the tail end of the Vietnam War. And I knew my number. And I knew the moment I stepped out of that school, I would be drafted. So I went into New York City and I joined the Air Force. And with all that turmoil and going on in the world at that time, and the danger for somebody my age and being in the military, I escaped it all. I wound up working for the Defense Intelligence Agency in Europe. And I always say that the brief period of time I was in Vietnam, it's more likely the ceiling will fall on me and kill me than I would have been killed there. That had a profound effect on my life. In my last year in the Air Force, I was living in Europe, and I realized I better get back to college. I'll be painting houses with my father. He had a little business where he painted houses. And I was wrestling in the Intercontinental Sports Congress. Somebody came by and said, "How would you like to go to the University of Maryland?" I said, "Great, I'll go to Maryland." I had never seen the place. I thought by that time I could wrestle on any level, and then I came here and found out what a real athlete was. And so my attempt to wrestle here was very brief and unsuccessful. But when I stepped on this campus, the academic world opened up to me. I saw things I had never seen before or experienced before. But you have to remember, I was living in Europe for a number of years. I had a lot of broadened my horizons. In my last year here, I had 2 jobs for my entire time. I worked for a company called Boise Cascade. And Boise Cascade, some of you may know, is a buildings material behemoth. And in those days, they were also developing communities. And I did cold calling. If you ever want to, it's the most humiliating job you could possibly have. Because if you make 100 cold calls, 99 people will slam the phone down on you. You didn't make much money. But if you could get a couple to go to a dinner at a steak restaurant, you could eat dinner there with them. And that's really was the biggest reward. The money was nothing. And I worked as a night manager at the In-State Inn, which was across from Andrews Air Force Base. And I had those jobs while I was going to school here. My last semester here, Dean, it's very similar to saying, I better get back to college. I'll be painting houses. My father. Now, of course, I needed a job. And the New York Times used to print on Sundays thousands of jobs in microscopic type. And I went home and I'm looking in the New York Times on a Sunday, and there was one job I qualified for. And it said management trainee, no experience necessary. Bingo, I qualified for that. And it was at American Mutual Insurance Company as a trainee in their claims department. I had no intention, believe me, of working in insurance. But I went through the training program, and because I was the only person who was single, I was the cheapest person to send off somewhere else, and they sent me to Syracuse. There were two problems with that. One, I was going out with a girl who lives in New York City and don't want to go to Syracuse. And second of all, did anybody from Syracuse, before I disparage the city of Syracuse, somebody throws something at me here? It is a difficult city. You'll grow up in Syracuse. It's a difficult city to grow up in, right? Yes. Because in October, things start to get very gray. And you get snow or something, precipitation from then until May. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it freed me from all of the corporate restrictions that if I had stayed in New York City, I would have been subject to. And the vice president of claims of that, at that time, a blue chip mutual insurance company had a bad rap against him. And what was that? That he wasn't developing young people. And I believe to this day, for lack of a body, he latched onto me. Less than 2 years later, I turned as the assistant manager of the largest region in the country, which was here in New York City. I was totally unqualified for that job. By the way, it wasn't the only job I've had that I've been totally unqualified. I was totally unqualified. I had no particular goal except one thing. I'm going to know more about this job than anybody else. I'm not a very introspective person. I never had in my life. I've met people who said, I know what I'm going to do, and I know what I'm going to achieve. First of all, I'm very cynical about that statement. But I believe there probably are people who, did set out to accomplish something and did accomplish it. I did not. However, I did want to know more about anything I did. And by the way, the word insurance, which appears all over, we try to eliminate that from the company. We're in the business of financing risk. And that's a much broader and much more interesting profession. I think I mentioned to the dean one time, some years ago in New York City, I was invited to a cocktail party where the deans of the 5 business schools here in the Washington, D.C. area were attending. And one of them came over to me and said they had done a survey of the students, graduate students who were in finance, and what area of finance did they want to go into. And he asked me, what percentage of the students said insurance? Zero, right? But he said, Bill, it's curious to me because when the alumni come back, the people in insurance are the biggest donors to the schools, right? So he said, why do you think that is? I said, the word insurance. I didn't want to be in insurance, so no interest in it. But the world of financing risk is different. So I worked for American Mutual, and I was a pretty good golfer. And so I would play in some regional pro-am golf tournaments. And one day somebody said to me, I want you to meet somebody. And he introduced me to Al Congdon, who was believed to be the finest trial lawyer in the city of New York. He was finest. And after a couple of meetings with Al, he asked me, he said, quit your job. He was forming a new law firm. Come with me. I'll pay your way through law school, and someday you'll own the law firm. And everything he said at that dinner came true. Unfortunately, Al died at a very young age. But when he died, I owned 89% of the law firm. I was, for many years, the last name on a much longer law firm name because I wasn't a lawyer. I went to, he was going to pay my way through law school. I formed this little consulting company, and we were building the law firm. And I lived in Port Washington. The office was in Garden City, and St. John's Law School is a perfect triangle, equilateral triangle. I said, bingo, I'm applying to one law school, and they accepted me, and that's really why I went. And I'm very happy I went to St. John's. Having been a mediocre student in high school, a better student here at Maryland, I did finish at the top of my class in law school. And I really think that's because it was also a lesson for me because I was more interested in what I was being exposed to in college than I was what I was being exposed to in high school. And I was much more interested in the subject matter in law school than as an undergraduate in college. And then he died. This little consulting company that I had formed and I wasn't interested in, I was the most comfortable in a courtroom. And at a very young age, I was representing major US corporations, like Stouffer Corporation, Audi, their domestic operation here in the United States, and foreign corporations, and particularly in Asia, which, by the way, led me to represent the city of Beijing, China, here in the United States for a number of years in very specialized litigation. Al died. Then there was a crisis in insurance in New York. And that crisis, it was a real eye-opener to me, Dean, that in our industry of financing risk, by the way, which houses more dollars than all the rest of the finance world, more dollars are housed in that term, insurance industry. Why would that be? Because we have to hold dollars longer, right? If we take money in today, the actuaries might tell me I have to hold some of that if I provided workers' compensation insurance, for example, for 52 years.
Wow.
Some percentage of that dollar. And where is that dollar? It's in my investment portfolio. While it's drawing out over 52 years, because the actuaries will say that that's how long I might have to finance a work-related accident. And that's why there are more dollars in the insurance industry, because we have to hold money longer. But what I saw was that this crazy industry with all that money would say they couldn't finance certain risk. And it wouldn't make any difference. We call it, if it's a soft market, premiums are lower, it's very competitive. If it's a hard market, premiums are higher, and it isn't as competitive. But it doesn't make any difference. There's always voids. And the void that allowed me to form the first insurance company was in the public sector and for public schools. If you can imagine this massive industry with more money than anybody, decided they couldn't figure out how to finance athletic-related injuries. If you can imagine, how would you open a public school if you didn't have insurance to cover a sports-related injury? That industry said they couldn't figure out how to finance the Board of Ed liability. The very buyers of insurance couldn't, it wasn't a price issue. They couldn't buy it. And I didn't know a lot about insurance, but that caught my attention. And so I went back to Hofstra Law Library, by the way, and I learned about insurance. What's this reinsurance, the secondary market? Long story short, I formed the first public sector-owned insurance company in the United States. It had no employees. I pulled out all of the operational aspect of that company and put it on the company I owned, which was called Wright Risk Management, WRIGHT. 2 years later, I formed the second public sector-owned insurance company in the United States to insure local government, towns, cities, villages, counties. By the way, both of those two companies together, if you look at the state of New York, finances about 68% of all the public sector risk in the state of New York. If you exclude the state of New York itself, the 5 boroughs of New York City, and the counties of Nassau and Suffolk. And the reason is that we're incompatible. But every other county, town, city, village, public school, they finance about 68% of all of the risk of the public sector of the state of New York. When I sold the company and to today. We went on to do other creative risk financing vehicles for healthcare, particularly for public employees. We got very creative, did things that had never been done before. And then I got involved in workers' compensation. We did the same thing, creative. This is a very high-level summary of what took me to 2007. And I'll touch on this a little more. When for the first time, by that time, I had a very valuable company. I had no partners, no debt, and I had a decision to make. Company was very valuable. And most people at that time would sell the company. You owe it to your family to do that. They sacked my wife. By the way, the biggest business decision anybody in this room will ever make will be the decision if you should be with a husband, a wife, or a partner, the decision you make of who that person will be. And I think I will mention again why that is, but as a pure business decision, that'll be the most important decision you make. You owe it to your family. Most people sell it. We were very successful. The second thing would be to take it public. And there was a lot of people who were looking for me to take the company public. But there was a guy by the name of Bill Berkeley, who I met early in my risk financing or insurance life. And he would like to tell you he formed the first insurance company out of his dorm room at Harvard. That's a little, some truth in that, but not tremendous truth. But he is probably the most successful person in my lifetime. He took the entrepreneurial track. He formed his own insurance company, and it's one of the biggest insurance holding companies in the United States. He always wanted to buy my company. And one day I had lunch with him, and he was looked tired. And I said, Bill, what makes you tired? He said, 31-year-old analysts. And I never forgot it. And I thought, all I need is to take this company public, and some 31-year-old analyst calls me tomorrow and wants to know why my stock went down 1/100th of 1% yesterday. I'll blow my brains out. So I eliminated that. There's only one other thing I could do then if I didn't sell the company, and that is, for the first time, to raise capital. And and build it to a much bigger company. And I decided to do that. And I rolled the entire value of the company I had into that deal. And that's when we launched the national insurance company, WRM America. By the way, the day that we agreed to that deal was the lowest day in the stock market in 2008.
Oh, wow.
The world was crashing around us. There was some risk in that because I didn't take a penny out of that deal. Thereafter, we bought a few companies. In 2010, we acquired the largest federal flood company in the country, purchased a Texas-based insurance company. By the way, we wrote 1 out of every 5 federal flood policies in the country. We bought it out of Fidelity Financial. Bought a Texas-based insurance company and a massive St. Petersburg, Florida fee-for-service company. And then in 2014, I sold the holding company in this massive deal that we did in 2014. And my wife thought, great, he's going to retire. And I was back in the office the next day doing what I do and forming Gramercy Risk Holdings, under which today we own two companies, another insurance company, a management company. We owned a third company, which we rolled into a larger company because we were finished with it and we made a few dollars. It wasn't big. And we won't do any acquisitions at Gramercy probably for another 24 months before we even look at it. The company's growing very quickly. And my son, who graduate, is a maniac Terp fan, I might add, is the chief operating officer of our holding company. He's doing great. He was going to be here today, but unfortunately, I dump a lot of responsibilities for board meetings on him, and we have 3 board meetings next week. And he said, Dad, yesterday, so he's not here. He might have been better off if he came and I stayed back, but that is this, and I'll speak about the company a little more, but that's, a 60,000 foot review of why I'm probably sitting here right now. But I've been one of the most fortunate humans that you've ever had sitting here speaking. I'm keenly aware of that. There's one thing I would like to say before any further, and I've told the dean this story, and it's sort of a retraction off of what I said about meeting somebody. So I knew what I wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to accomplish. I did it and I accomplished it. And I'm always reticent about that. But I'm sure there are people that way. But also, I never was a long-term vision thinker. But I had a clear view of the pathway that I needed to take to get to the next level. Not that there's something out there somewhere that I'm going to achieve ultimately, but to take it to the next level and then to see a pathway. And my favorite story, which, by the way, was the last story I told the students at the commencement address that I gave here. It was, some of you probably heard this story, and I think it was a story became legendary about Abraham Lincoln, and that was that a lot of you know Abraham Lincoln was highly unsuccessful in his early attempts to be a public person and to gain, he would run for public office and lose, and so he kept doing it. And then when he won the congressional seat, opponent was a minister. And because Lincoln had no established religion of any kind, you think politics is kind of ugly today. It was always been ugly, right? And that candidate was running on the fact that Lincoln was an atheist. And he would tell the voters, he's not like us, this minister, right? He's an atheist. And that was the major thing he was attacking Lincoln for. And Lincoln heard about this, and he heard that that minister, that opponent of his, was speaking at a church locally. So Lincoln decided to go and hear him speak. And it came a point where the minister said, everybody in this church who thinks they're going to heaven, stand up. And I guess like in this room, most people stood up. Then he said, who in this audience thinks they're going to hell? And maybe also like in this room, a couple of people stood up, right? But he noticed Lincoln didn't stand up. In either case, he said, Mr. Lincoln, where do you think you're going? And he said, to Congress. And I like that story because Lincoln, and he never would have said to the White House, but he saw where he wanted to go. And he saw a pathway to get there. And my whole career has been based on that.
Thank you for sharing this, your background to where you are today. I was trying to summarize, I think it's a lot. But you said you shouldn't tell the dean, but I'll tell that. The very well-known fact, I shouldn't say fact, but we always talk about it. A lot of C level executives in reality are C students. It's not A students. So that's because they tend to take more risk. But I think you talked about knowing the domain in which you work, trying to be good at that's very important. connection and networks. And you have to build those networks, otherwise you can't do much. You don't have to be the smartest in order to do great things. And you always understand the need and gap before you start something, because you fill your entrepreneurial mindset to fill that gap. So a lot of things, and I love the word financing risk. Jeff, maybe we should never call it insurance, financing risk.
If you could do that here at Maryland, I'd appreciate that, because we would get more students in finance to be interested in our business. Think about this. I thought the practice of the law was the greatest profession in the world, right? How interesting is this? Every case I got was different. And I'd love being in a court, and that was where I felt actually the most comfortable. But think about this. The risk a corporation enters into, a government enters into. So to analyze, to see it, analyze it, quantify it, put a price on that, to mitigate it through risk management, and to manage it through claims, litigation, blah, blah, blah. And plus, we have the largest corporate portfolios. So to understand the nature of those portfolios. So if we could speak about in business schools all over the country that we're in the business of financing risk.
Right. I would like to have it more interactive. If anybody has a question you can raise, otherwise I'll keep going here. You addressed a lot of questions in my thing already, so I'm going to skip few. In the business of risk management, what were the biggest risks you personally had to take, and how did you think through those decisions?
The biggest risk I took was the first and second insurance companies. We had no money. Now think about this. We financed 54 public schools, and you need $2.2 million in New York to license a property and casualty. I should also say that I know nothing about personal lines insurance. Everybody here knows more about homeowners insurance than I do. I know it. We're on the commercial side, all right? So I should make that clear. But you need $2.2 million to license the company. But where would I get $2.2 million? I didn't have any money. So what I convinced the public schools to do, because their fiscal year is July 1 to July 1, and the public sector entity cannot pay for something in one fiscal year that they can't realize until the following fiscal year, right? They can't actually pay for it. So what I did was convince enough superintendents to send me post-dated checks in June, dated July 1st. And somebody from the then New York State Insurance Department was sent to my office. And every time a check would hit my office, they would add it up. And when it hit $2.2 million, they released the license. That was very risky, because we insured 52 and then 54 school districts. That year, districts, probably about 200 or more schools with $2.2 million in capital. And then the second company was even more risk, because the New York State Insurance Department was desperate to get a municipal insurance company up and running. And they saw the success of the first company. I knew how to do it now, but you can't go to a mayor or a county executive or a town supervisor and say, give me a post-dated check. Superintendents of schools are a little different. They did it. So unfortunately, I had to go back to the insurance department. Now, by the way, we don't have an insurance department. We have a Department of Financial Services merging all financial services, which is unfortunate because you lose the expertise. But then we had an insurance department. And I went back down to see the superintendent, and I said, I can't do it. I've done everything else. I put the secondary financing together, the back end reinsurance together, because I knew how to do it. But I couldn't raise the capital. And he stared at me. And I took a guy named Jerry Ellicks with me, who I'd gone to law school with. He eventually became the chief operating officer at that company. I said, come with me, and I'm going to tell him we have to stop this. We're not going to do it. And he kept staring at me, and he said these words to me. He saw what we did with the first company. He said, we had no money, no capital now. He said, will you promise me that you'll have $2.2 million when you submit the first annual statement, which would be 13 months later? And I thought through because I saw what we had done. And I said, well, I can't guarantee anything, but I think, yeah, we'll have that. And I left, and there was a bar across the street called the Odeon Bar. And I said, Jerry, come with me. And I said, Jerry, what do you think he just did in there? He said, I think he's going to issue a license. I was taking my family to Hawaii the next day. I said, Jerry, he may do it, but I'm not doing it. So if that license arrives in the office while I'm away, just lock it in the safe. I'm not doing it. But you know, you lay on the beach in Hawaii for a couple of days, the world looks a little different for you. We licensed that company with zero capital. That was the biggest risk I ever took. Those are too high. Like I said, they insure vast percentages of total public sector of the state of New York. When I left that company, by the way, the first company, I left it with $195 million of free surplus and didn't raise a penny beyond the $2.2 million, all from underwriting profit. And the second company was even healthier, but it was smaller than the school. Schools pay much. Are the biggest premium writers, issuers in New York State, public schools. So the second one didn't have as much surplus, had the same ratios. That is, somebody was mentioning, how you stress these companies. Was asking me before I came down here, and we have this risk-based capitals is a big test for us. How much capital do you have as against the risk and things? Both of them, when I sold the company, were in great shape. They're both a best A-rated companies, by the way, which is our rating agency.
Oh, that's one. So I'm going to ask this question. Numerous surveys says 50% of the students would like to be entrepreneurs. Right? But we know the statistics, it's nowhere near 50%, but they like to be. So the path is definitely not an easy one. You already expanded, but from your perspective, what does it take to be successful as an entrepreneur in a very traditional and competitive industry like insurance or financing risk, we'll call that?
Yeah. So, I told the dean that I spoke at a forum like this a number of years ago at University of Maryland, and the audience was mostly people who were looking, students looking to become entrepreneurs, to own their own companies. And I gave an answer that I cringe at to this day. And there was a lot of professors there who I think would have had me disappear if they could. And I said, people in this audience want to be entrepreneurs. They want to own their own businesses, but they don't. They think they do, but they don't. I will never give that answer again. But oftentimes, people might have the desire to go the entrepreneurial route, as I did. We formed our own companies and did that, thinking that they'll own it. True. And they'll be free to make the decisions they want to make. And there's where the problem starts to arise. Right from the beginning, depending on what industry or what product you're selling, you're restrained by markets. You're restrained by capital. Somebody said to me one time, it must be great to be able to make any decision you want to make. And I just laughed at it. Probably said, I can't make any decisions I want to make. But I'll give you a little to be revealing on this. When Al Congdon died, and I had licensed that first company, I went into the office on a Saturday morning, and it was dark on a hallway in our corporate headquarters. And I was walking down the hall, and I just stopped. And I said, now you own it all. And within a microsecond, what went through my head? No, you don't. I had a job to do. My job title was different. My job description was different. And if I could stay focused on that, not that I owned the company, but that I had a job to do. And I had surrounded myself with smart people. And by the way, I don't want to overemphasize that I'm not as bright as anybody else in the room, by the way. That's for sure. But it's true, you know, I mean, but I did, that's why I said I finished at the top of my law school class. So that's what I want you to remember, not to. But seriously, I think that was a wonderful reflexive reaction I had. Because if you think you own it and you can do whatever you want, your chances of success will be far less. So I only caution people who want to take the entrepreneurial track. There are things about it that are difficult. You're responsible ultimately for all your employees and their families. I had been offered jobs in the insurance industry to be CEOs of massive commercial companies. Those employees would have been far away from me. But when you form your own company, you have a rough day and you wonder whether you can meet the payroll. Only you have that responsibility. And think about the families that you might have put at risk. And so I just caution you not to not take the entrepreneur. I think it's a wonderful thing. That's what is great about this country. You will create things that haven't existed before. I was lucky enough to do that, but that's what this country is all about, right? If you have an inclination to take that route, do it. But be mindful of the responsibilities, challenges that if you decided to be the chief financial officer in the biggest company in the United States, you would not have those responsibilities. You wouldn't take home to your family, the concerns about the families of every employee in your company as you're building that company.
Thank you for sharing. I have a lot of questions that the students submitted, but please come ahead and I would like you to ask the question. Go ahead. Please tell your name and which program you're in.
Cool. My name is Gabriel Rosella. I'm a finance and public policy major. You mentioned you went to law school. So for those of us who maybe aren't as good as golf as you, would you pay full price?
Today, everybody in this room is as good as golf.
Maybe. Would you pay full price for law school today? And how has that impacted your life and career?
I would. And when I went to law school, by the way, Gabriel, I didn't think about how valuable that education would be if I went into business. Because remember, I went to law school to be the best litigator I could be, to try as many cases I could try, to be in the courtroom if I could every day. But when I look back on it, and I'll tell you why, I have found that the legal education has been invaluable to me. Now, why might that be? First of all, it's a Socratic method, right? In other words, if you were to go from graduate school here to the University of Maryland's law school in Baltimore, the challenge in the first year is it's a completely different way of learning. What is that? It's the Socratic method. Oftentimes we graduate from undergraduate, we study, we learn, we know the answers. And then you get to law school. And how does that work? Well, the textbooks don't answer anything. They're just full of cases. I had a brilliant contracts professor, Bernie Gagan. He was renowned in this country. And everywhere I live, every home we have, every office I have still has his textbook in there. And what that method is you would get cases to read in advance of the next class. And sometimes the cases did not give you the conclusion, but sometimes they'd give you the facts and everything and the conclusion. So if you'd assume if you were called on and you could recite the facts and you could recite the conclusion, bingo, I'm good. Nope. Because what would happen? Let's say it's contracts, right? Bernie Gagan would say, okay, they found the contract did exist in this case. On the basis there was consideration on both sides of that contract, meaning both sides either put money up, or exchange money, or exchange services, or whatever. But that didn't exist in that case. How could the court have found there was a contract? Well, because to be a contract, the other party might have avoided to do something. And the avoidance itself provided adequate consideration. Or they'll tell you the statute of frauds, which should be called the statute against frauds, certain contracts have to be in writing. How could this contract have been valid when it fit into that class of contracts that needs to be in writing? And then it goes constantly, all the exceptions. So what were they teaching you there? Ask questions. You know, when Jack Kennedy failed at the Bay of Pigs, history tells us he went into a deep state of depression. Because Jack Kennedy knew, he asked some questions that he didn't ask enough questions. I will tell you the biggest business failures I have seen at an acquisition. You see two companies, one company acquire another company, or they'll merge and they go on TV and say, this is the greatest thing in the world for both companies, blah, blah, blah. And then what happens? 5 years later, it isn't working and both companies are less valuable than they were the day before. Most of the time, there weren't enough questions asked. I've had two failures in my business life, and thank God they were not. Matter of fact, they were a lot of money at the time. They don't seem to be a lot of money to me today. But like, for example, my principle of acquiring a company is like a three-legged stool. One is the product or service on a high level, because I wouldn't know how to manage or be successful trying to market a less than a high level product or service, a blue chip company providing blue chip services or selling Maseratis. I could see that. That's one leg of the stool. It's a product or service on a high level. Second of all, is there a need? You know, somebody could come along and say, I just made the finest rotary phone ever made in the world. Great, except there's no need for a rotary phone. So the second leg of the stool is it needed? The third leg of that stool is the reason I failed on both companies. And I didn't ask enough questions. And that is, can management execute on the business plan? It's a high-level product or service. There was definitely a need. One company I collapsed, and the other company, thank God, I was able to change the management of, and we'll get out of there alive. So and I just gave you one reason why I think a legal education has been invaluable to me. Surround yourself with really good people, as Jack Kennedy did. But he thought, I'm surrounding myself with the smartest people in the United States. And when they gave him advice, he didn't question it, and he knew it after the Bay of Pigs. And that's why he was in depression. Law school will teach you to never stop asking questions, even when you're surrounded by the smartest people. I've known two geniuses in my life. One headed up our appellate department in the law firm. The other became my first general counsel at the first large company I formed. I respected those two people without a doubt. I questioned them constantly. And I think for some reason, although I don't think they hated me, I don't think they loved me either. They knew. I keep saying that they were smarter than I was, because it's become like a, but seriously, their IQs were higher than I was, and they knew it. And I think they also were standing where they were standing, and I was sitting where I was sitting. But I would constantly question them. I did believe them, but law school taught me to question.
Yeah. So others who want to have questions can come to that mic.
So,
Can you hear so that everybody can hear your question?
Okay.
Yeah, please. Others can just.
By the way, Gabriel, that answer your question? At least in part, yeah. I would go to law school if I was you.
Yeah, can anyone hear me? Yeah, so I had more of a technical question, and
Your name.
so yes, I'm so sorry. I'm Malay, and I'm in Masters of Business Analytics, and I had a question about private credit. So as you said, you raised your capital back in 2007, and private credit right now is being defined as the new subprime loans, just because as of this month, the rate of default for big companies is 5.8%, whereas for smaller companies that has gone over 15.8%. So I wanted to ask your perspective on the risk, both as a private citizen and as a business leader. I'm sorry, as a business leader, what would you define the risk in private credit to be?
Is the risk of the capital itself, raising the capital itself?
Both raising the capital and giving the capital from a business perspective.
First of all, right now, these are hard questions to answer, right? Because we're in a fast-moving world right now with regard to capital, and I'm not so sure. I think the risks are greater now. I'm lucky in our business because when you form insurance companies and you finance risk, our corporate portfolios have to be so narrowly. I can't invest in offshore drilling rigs, for example, right? The rules of risk-based capital requires our portfolios to be nauseatingly conservative. If the industry does, as a whole, return of 4.9% on their portfolio, that's good, right? So some of the risks, I think, I may not be getting the question quite right. We experience less risk in a volatile capital environment than other corporations. And the cost of money to us is less.
Understood.
Because when we do bring capital in, that motivation for that capital is to find a safe haven often, right? We often viewed as a hedge against volatile capital markets.
Understood. And as a private citizen, how would you see these loans being given out? Because these loans do not have the checks that are done by traditional banks, so they are more credit driven.
Are you talking about subprime?
No, private
Private
credit,
credit.
which
Oh,
is
private credit.
yes.
And apologize, explain exactly what is the question about private credit,
So private credit is loans given out to private companies
right?
by private companies, which are usually PE firms.
Yep.
So the loans given out are not as thoroughly checked as in traditional banks. So they have a higher default rate.
Yes.
Right now, for smaller companies, it's up to 15%. And
Okay, I
yeah.
got it. All right. First of all, there is such a thing as usury in this country, I still believe. So when you start speaking about, not that I know what that is anymore, but let me go even before that. If you're starting out raising capital and you own your own business, you're going to have to personally guarantee that note. I don't care how successful that company is. A traditional lender, a bank, right? You have a company doing $100 million a year and you own it. And you want a $1 million line of credit. Forget about the interest, the debt service on that. You're going to have to personally guarantee it. By the way, that's another thing you should think about going the entrepreneurial route, I might add. I remember the day I no longer had to personally guarantee notes, and it made my wife very relieved. She was more relieved than anybody. But seriously, so number one, out of 15%, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
That might be out of 15%. I would be very reluctant to borrow money in that kind of an environment. With a stock market as volatile as this market is, you're doubling down on risk here. I mean, I'm already in the risk business, right? By the way, I was asked to attend a hedge fund meeting in California a couple of years ago. They never should have invited me, of course, but they did. And I wound up on a panel of all these hedge fund guys. I'm not really much to contribute to this thing. I had spoken, and it's a rather large audience. There were about 500 people in the audience, all in the hedge fund world. And I said, I'll bet everybody in this room, if I started to speak about risk, you'd say, we're in the risk business. We understand risk. And I said, however, if you in that risk business invest in my company, you're doubling down on risk because that's my business. So you're taking risk capital and putting in to a company that its very product and service is to finance risk. I don't know how impressed they were by that, but I did say that. So a simple answer to me right now is if you could avoid doing anything like that with a 15% interest rate on it in this environment, unless you're a hell of a risk taker, I would. And also, by the way, and all of this, raising capital, about is how long you can sustain your position. Meaning, people get really hurt if they have to have capital in over a short period of time because they have to get in and out. Those are the people that get hurt. If you have the ability to survive over a long period of time, even in a downturn in markets, the risk is much less, of course. So, and by the way, today, unlike any time, we're affected by global markets, right? I think that this whole idea, when I hear somebody debating about globalization, I want to scream. That horse left the barn a long time ago. And I asked anybody, by the way, in this room, if every time the little company of Greece gets into trouble, my corporate portfolio, my private portfolio, anybody who has a 401k plan gets hurt by it. That's why we bail them out all the time. I love Greece, but they always say we'll do better, but sometimes they don't. If we can be so affected by an economic problem or a fiscal problem within a small country like Greece, does anybody in this room think if China gets into real difficult financial, but what it will do to this country and to our corporations? Globalization is history. It's already happened. And there's no escaping it. These are volatile times, geopolitical issues, and I'm not borrowing money now. I'm not raising capital now. We don't get like Testudo, we trade your shell or something. But we do speak about, okay, look, let's just focus on what we are doing. We are very ambitious, but we are very conservative the way we go about that. And I can't think of a better time to be that way than right now.
Thank you.
Hi again. My name's Erna. I'm an MBA student and I do have two questions for you. Once my notes load back up. With all the uncertainty in the job market, if you were in the business program, what would you do differently or what field would you go into outside of risk management? And then with the evolving landscape, what is the leadership quality that you may not have learned when you were in school, but believe everyone should really practice and implement now to become future business leaders?
So you're asking me what field other than the field I'm in right now? Is that the first question that I might go into? It wouldn't take a business major, I'd go into education. But I'm intrigued by creative capital of all kinds. And I would probably, at that stage of my career, right, as I was graduating with an MBA right now from a business school or a undergraduate degree in business, I would think I would not go into a traditional financial entity like a bank or a major bank or certainly a major insurance company. That's the field I'm in, but I would look for something more creative. I'm going to tell you, I should tell this quick story about that issue of creativity, right? I hope everybody kind of remembers this. Does anybody in this room know who M. Night Shyamalan is?
Yes.
Right?
Big Six.
When he was in his early 20s, he had the #1 picture at Pixar, the #1 picture at Disney, and I believe the #1 picture at Paramount, but I'm not really sure what the third studio was. Hollywood had never seen anything like this. He was a phenom in Hollywood. And then what happened? His career plateaued, and that went down, 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 down. And he was asked about that. He was interviewed and asked, what happened? How can he explain this? First, he said that Bob Dylan told him he never wrote a great song after the age of 25. By the way, I heard Bob Dylan as an undergraduate student right here on this campus, by the way.
Oh, impressive.
He said, if you're lucky and you're talented to be ultimately successful, there comes a time when the knowledge side of your brain and the creative side of your brain hits a perfect spot. You have enough knowledge to execute on that creativity. Then what happens after that? The knowledge side of your brain starts to overwhelm the creative side for many reasons, one of which now you got something to lose. And that's not a good thing. As a matter of fact, that's why I raised capital in 2000. Said, I got to get this company much bigger, because I realized with all the creative things we did and the value that was put on that company was fairly high. Every dollar came from something that had never been done before. And it dawned on me, we hadn't done anything creative in a long time. We had built this very successful company, and it scared the hell out of me, because I thought there's somebody else out there right now at their stage of their career, and their creative side of their brain has come up. They're going to come up with better ways to do this. And I would tell the executive staff always, to this day, by the way, success is the worst drug in the world. Because think about it. If you're successful, you say, we know how to do it, right? We're successful. Somebody can say, we should change this and should change that, right? Why? We're success. That's a drug. It dulls your senses. That scared me. We weren't doing things. So first thing I would say is look for a fund or a place where capital is very creative at this stage of your career. What was the second part of that question?
The second part was focusing on if there was a leadership skill that you didn't really develop when you were in school or get the chance to really acknowledge and learn about, and especially with the different landscape and all the information. And we're in such a fortunate place to be in an institution with such diversity and different communities together. What's a leadership skill that you see today that you would recommend us to really hone on to and really put it into leadership practice?
Okay, there's a couple parts to that question. First of all, I want you to know I am a big, big supporter of diversity within corporate America. We as a company, we actually put board members on our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. We invest, we provide scholarships at schools that are very diverse, that have high level of Pell Grant students, right? And when I was asked a question about it, because as we know more recently, that's become under some, as if I can't do that. Yeah. And I had a simple answer to it. If I can expand the pool of potential employees, more diverse, that I can draw off of, I'm going to get better employees. It's just mathematical. By the way, my mother said, you can't add, you better go to law school. That was one of the things she gave me. So number one, always our organizations have been major supporters of diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's just that if you formalize it within a hiring process today, you better keep your head down. And I object to that tremendously. However, nobody can criticize me from providing scholarships at a school where 75% of the students are on Pell Grants, and develop a relationship with that school and develop a relationship with those students. And I increase then the pool of people I can hire from. And I will hire based on just pure math, better employees. That's the best part. And what was the other part of that? Well, the skill set.
The
of being-
skill set of leadership.
I think I said I'm not that introspective, to be quite honest, but I've learned, look, they're just life skills. In other words, it may sound frivolous in a way, but you lead by words. But those words have to be believed. You don't lead by deeds. But if those words can't be backed up by deeds, you can't lead. But you lead, I learned you lead by words, by your ability to communicate. And the ability to get people to believe you. If employees or clients, or Lord knows in insurance, we have all these reinsurers that we sell off risk to. Every year, we have to put all new secondary markets together to, we want to form a new company or go to a new market. We've got to put all that together. If you cannot get those reinsurers to believe you, you can't lead that company. You can't not succeed. And it was something I'm pretty sure in the beginning I wasn't really thinking about. I would also suggest I think we had spoken about a competitive industry I'm in, right? Do you know that when I sold the company, that big holding company, the insurance companies I formed had over 98% retention of insureds over a quarter of a century. They stayed with us. And I thought about that as to how that happened. And I think it happened because we were putting ourselves in the, I would always think, if I was sitting where they're sitting, how would I view us? And I think that was it. By the way, I'm also dyslexic, not profoundly dyslexic, and I didn't even know it until I was way into my adulthood. And I'm a speed reader, and how could that possibly be? I'm not profoundly dyslexic. But I met a woman by the name of Jeanette Jansky, and I think this is an important thing for all people who want to be successful in business. And she was renowned in this country. She was one of the early educators of children with learning disabilities. Jeanette Jansky wrote a book called Why Johnny Can't Read. She had a public TV show, and she had a very high-level school in New York. The Rockefeller family is riddled with, Nelson Rockefeller was so profoundly dyslexic that when he would meet you, he would go, "Hi, fella." And people thought he was trying to act like a regular guy, right? No, he wasn't, because if you're profoundly dyslexic, you don't remember anybody's name. And that's how he would greet everybody. How you doing, fella? So she had that school. Very wealthy families would send their children. And I got to meet her. And she told me this. She said, Bill, I got to know her very well. When a 18-month-old child is in the back of a car in a car seat, and that child is looking out the window, that child believes that the whole world is in the car looking out through that window. Now, of course, as we mature, we know there's a world outside the window looking in, but she said not perfectly. But we still see the world through our own eyes. And I think to be an effective leader, you should try to the best of your ability to see the world through others' eyes, through the eyes of your competitors, the eyes of your clients, the eyes of your partners, whether they're capital partners or otherwise. And the ability to do that, I think, will help you to a great degree to achieve some of the things you want to achieve, because you'll then think about it. And I say, well, wait a minute. I used to go into the office, by the way, on a Saturday and randomly sit at somebody's desk. And yeah, you see pictures of their family, and that's good. And learn. That's not why I was doing it. what I was doing is I realized I see this corporation from where I sit. How would I see this corporation if I came every day to the office and sat where this person's sitting? Look at who's around them. What do they do? If I was them, how would I view the company? And I think that was helpful to me to, whatever success I've had.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Hello, my name is Raghav. I'm a computer science major, but I'm also minoring in business. So there's a famous quote from a show that says chaos is a ladder. Many people see chaos as something to avoid, but ambitious people see it as an opportunity. You mentioned you signed one of your biggest deals on the lowest day of the 2008 financial crisis. Do you believe that chaos actually is a ladder that rewards the prepared? And what gave you the courage to take the risk and climb it yourself?
I think it's a part of how we define things, how we define risk and how we define chaos. I have not read that book, by the way, but I'll make a mental note to take a look at it. I think I define risk differently, perhaps intuitively than other people. I don't see risk where others may see risk. So number one, I don't see chaos where maybe others see chaos. I look at all that as an opportunity, really. Now I'm not foolish, and I don't ignore risk, and I don't ignore what chaos could mean to me. But I'm not frightened by it. And I had mentioned a guy named Jerry Alex who went down to the insurance department with me when they let me license the company with no money, right? Jerry's brilliant. But Jerry can see on the most beautiful day in the world, there's a storm coming. And he sees that dark side. He sees the danger of risk. He sees chaos. He walked into my office one day and said, "You're not afraid, are you?" I thought, it's how crazy a statement. His view of chaos and his view of risk was different than mine. So I'm not unmindful of chaos and what it could do to my company. We have a lot of chaos in the world right now. I told you it has affected me. We are not overly aggressive in this 2026 budget, even from a pure operational standpoint. We'll grow, and I think we're going to have a really good year this year, but we're being very careful. We're not raising capital, which I didn't intend to do anyway. We're not buying anything. We're not selling anything. What you might see in that book is chaos around us. It's out there. So I'm mindful of it. I'm not unmindful of just risk in general. I guess maybe I define it a little differently. And when Jerry sees a cloud coming, I do see opportunity because, I never saw any opportunity in doing something. Somebody comes, they say, we ought to get in this business because Travelers Insurance Company is making a lot of money. And I would say, why would I want to get in a business that Travelers Insurance Company is making a lot of money? And number one, they got boatload more capital than I do. And second of all, the CEO is a lot smarter than I am. So in other words, that chaos and risk presents opportunity. If the insurance industry hadn't been chaotic in its dealings with the public sector, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. That was the opportunity.
In one of the companies, oil company, everybody takes risk as downside. So they actually train the entire employee on upside risk. Because everybody fears, so they stop. So they actually said, no, there's an upside when there is risk. You have to exploit those things. So that's why, and I think in stock market, they always look at upside risk.
Yeah. Yes. But I think it's a very human thing. You have to. I'm going to tell you something else that I wanted to mention here is, everybody knows who Arnold Palmer was, right? The great golfer. And in the last decade of his life, if he was here right now, he would end this by saying, swing your own swing. And what was he really saying? If he had tried to swing the way his hero, that is Ben Hogan, he never would have become Arnold Palmer. If Jack Nicklaus tried to mirror Arnold Palmer's swing, he never would have become the greatest golfer of all time. If Tiger Woods had tried to mirror Nicklaus's swing, never would have become Tiger Woods. And so he would say, swing your own swing. Be your own person. But if you look, and I've analyzed the golf swing, that's some of the most exceptional. You could have the most unusual golf swing, but about 6 inches before you hit the ball, you'd be squaring the club the same way Arnold Palmer did, the same way Jack Nicklaus did, the same way, you know. How the journey you took to get there is uniquely yours. But the ultimate goal, those principles of squaring the head of that golf club, are the same. You can learn those here. In this, you're so lucky to be here, by the way, to have the opportunity to get an education on this campus in this business school. But you will take the journey different. You'll see risks different than I do. But ultimately, 6 to 8 inches before you achieve what you want to achieve, you and I will have reached a very similar spot. And those principles that you will learn to square that club are what you can learn here. The journey will be yours. You will see us differently than I do.
It's a brilliant one. I think I'm going to use that. Joe, you had a question. Thank you, though.
Yeah, thank you.
you.
Hi, thank you. Joe Bailey, faculty member here. I'm curious how you would encourage students to think about kind of long-term systemic risk, like something like climate change, that might be affecting not just your clients, but rather the whole system.
That's a really good question. Climate change is affecting all of us. It alters the economic environment. It alters the economies of countries. We're gonna see even though we talk about this all the time, but the world has not gotten its hands around climate change, right? Countries lurch in and out of this, commit to it one day, and then when it's expedient to withdraw, they withdraw. We happen to live in one of those countries. If I was worried about my grandchildren, by the way, I have 5 little granddaughters. The oldest is 9. So if anybody knows of a family that has 5 little boys and wants to do a trade, we might. We said we didn't know that God was making any more boys. But if I was worried about their future right now, I think I would worry about it in the context of climate change. Nobody in this room at this stage of your careers will be unaffected by climate change. I see on Long Island where I live, the very profile of the island, how it has dramatically changed since I was a child because of the rising water and dramatically altering the coastline. You say, well, yeah, well, that's okay, there's water in, water out, and but it's taking business away. The fishing industry on Long Island is not what it used to be because the very fish that drove the economy, and before I was born, was the economy, along with farming, of Long Island, doesn't exist anymore. We have to seed so much of the fish beds to just allow fishermen, and so fewer of them than there ever were before, just to carve out a living. If I was a lender to the fishing industry on Long Island, I would worry about climate change. I'm sure that those lenders are factoring in, as somebody mentioned before, the cost of capital, the fact that there are much more risks to that capital today than there would have been 25 years ago. So if I was worried about my grandchildren's future, or if I was sitting where the people in this room are sitting at this stage of their career, I would be very mindful. of the effects of climate change on any industry or business that you would choose to go into in the future. And I would be very cautious about long-term debt in that respect. I don't know how you avoid that, by the way, in many industries. I'm worried about these because I told you, we hold money a longer period of time, right? Those portfolios that look good. And by the way, I'm very proud to say our portfolio has averaged for over a quarter of a century, 1.5 points higher than the commercial insurance industry as a whole. And I have now a capital partner who is essentially a portfolio manager, Charles Slattery at WT Capital, who's doing a fantastic job for us. So we're doing well, but we hold money for a long period of time. And the returns on that capital are going to be affected by climate change. There's no doubt in my mind at all. We are trying to risk manage that. By the way, if anybody wants to know, or there's any question in anybody's mind in this room, that we are experiencing dramatic climate change that is being adversely affected by human beings, go to Munich, Germany, and visit. There's a city within a city in Munich, Germany, that is owned by Munich Reinsurance Company, one of the largest secondary markets in the world, right? They have been studying climate change in that company in Munich since 1952. And I had been invited by the board to go to spend time with the board of Munich Re. They've been partners of mine for 30 years now. Some years ago, and as part of that, I visited this climate center and these brilliant scientists. And I guarantee you, if you have any question about whether there is dramatic climate change and how effective it is by man or not, if you had the experience I had to walk out of there, there'd be no more questions in your mind. They don't give a damn about the social effects of climate change in that room. They are clear about the economic impact of climate change because they're laying money out over the long term. And when they say there's dramatic climate change and it is dramatically affected by the lifestyle of human beings, I think I'm pretty sure that both of those things are true.
So we have a few minutes. You have a question? I know you are a brilliant communicator. Go ahead. He was in another event yesterday. He was asking some really
By the way,
profound.
I had no place to go, Dean. Yeah, I could stay.
Okay. He's going to ask some.
Okay.
Thank you.
So maybe
Oh,
we should leave now before he asks this question.
is this okay? It's on now, I think.
Mhm.
Hi, I'm Shri. I'm a finance major, and I would like to shift gears for a second. Hopefully, you don't mind. You spoke very warmly about your mother, and it was very heartwarming for me to hear. I remember you saying she taught you to never be scared. But if I were to go back to what you said about creativity and the knowledge part of your brain that eventually over time decreases, you mentioned that you felt fear at that point in time.
Yeah, that's really
I don't mean to be nitpicky with
no,
your words,
that's a very good question.
but my something I would like to know is, are you shifting your fear into something positive, embracing the negative, or is it that you don't see it at all?
Well, first of all, let me say I know very few things in life that are binary. So if I say that my mother taught me not to be afraid, and she did, and I do believe I've been profoundly affected by that, and I don't see fear, I don't experience fear. But I did tell you I became afraid when I realized that we hadn't done anything creative, right? The creative side of our brain had been overwhelmed by the knowledge side. So if the question is, what do you do with fear when you feel it, what effect it might have?
Yeah, that is if you see it at all.
I think fear mostly is overwhelmingly is negative. But a complete lack of fear is almost pathologically insane. So she did teach me not to be afraid over and over and over. But I did feel probably as uncomfortable in business as I've ever been when we were the most highly successful before I raised that capital and realized, holy mackerel, we haven't done anything creative here. This highly successful company, which every dollar of its value had come from something that had never been done before, and we hadn't done anything creative in quite a while.
Hopefully I can get one more question in. It seems that your entire business, the line of business you're in, you say you're financing risk. It's all about risk and uncertainty. And I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you gamble on the side? Do you think, are you any good at it if you do? And I want to hear, I guess, how you square the two.
Okay. Well, first of all, I speak out in Las Vegas once a year so I can spend 2 days playing Texas Hold'em. I think sports gambling is destroying athletics, and I enter every pool the company has. I'm not a gambler in business.
Yep.
I'm almost, I think I said to the dean, I'm very socially liberal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very fiscally conservative.
Mm-hmm.
So I do not gamble in business. I take, I hope, calculated risk. Now, how do you reach that level where you think it's calculated, right?
Mm.
Let's say we're going to enter a market.
Yeah.
Before I allow the company to enter a market, we can drive investors and boards crazy because of the length of time we will take to go from wanting to be in that market to the moment we pull the trigger and enter the market. Our due diligence protocol can actually frustrate investors and boards, right? We take a long time looking at those markets. So we're entering into a risk area, a new risk area, a new market. We're going to be putting a supermarket program together, right? Now you'd say, well, you guys have been in such risky stuff, all education, public education, government risk, all this, right? It's taken us 2 years. We'll launch that program on April 1st. It's 2 years of our due diligence before we enter that market, which is essentially a brick and mortar business, right? And all the risk is within 4 walls of a building. So to mitigate that risk and not to gamble entering a market, we spend a long time on the due diligence side of that before we do. And I've had capital partners that made it crystal clear they weren't happy. And I made it crystal clear we're not changing how we do it.
Thank you.
Hey, I know this. I never asked a question on AI.
Yeah.
Oh, no. How could you do that? That'll be the last question, I guess.
Yeah.
Does AI help? Oh, I'm sorry. You want to ask? Go ahead.
Actually, so can I steal it?
Yeah, please go ahead. We're running out of time, so we have to be quick.
Oh. So I would like to first share a little bit of what signals we are seeing in the industry. I'm, by the way, Lavan Gangiseri, CEO, Epitome Technology. So what we do is enterprise IT. Why I came here today was I wanted to see both the aspects. I know you're public sector, you finance public sectors and public schools. So how you perceive risk in terms of technology investments, which is a drastical change from, a couple generations to now.
Mm-hmm.
And also wanted to understand a little bit from the universities, all those business students who, going to get to the next C-level suites. how they have to perceive that risk in terms of, like, say, digital transformations or AI. Because now we see that the leaders in a company are not necessarily operational, but more productivity and efficiency, and are data driven. So I wanted to understand a little bit when you said the 2 years of due diligence you did,
Yeah.
how much of that is more towards like data driven versus,
Well, first of all, you're speaking to somebody who's in a more data-driven industry than any other industry in the world, right? We house more data. We make decisions. Almost every decision we make, right, it has to come off of that data. So where are we in the arc of technology versus you? A very good point, and I think leads you to the AI question and versus operations, right? First of all, the industry, the insurance industry itself, was the first into technology. So if you look after World War II, where did IBM sell all the mainframes?
Yeah, insurance.
Sold it to the insurance industry. And that was good and bad. Why? They invested a lot of money. They got the advantage of that technology more than banks or any other part of the financial world, faster. But what it also did was put them behind the curve of the advancement in technology, leaving them with legacy systems. You can accumulate all the data in the world, but if you can't report that data out in a form that's usable on the operational side, right, it's useless. The industry struggled for many, many years with the integration of legacy systems and was behind other financial institutions in the advancement, right? Now, you might have thought that if in the 50s they were on the frontier of this and were left behind with all these legacy systems, they've long since resolved it. On the train coming down here, I went on my phone, and one of the apps I have is business insurance. And do you know what the lead article in business insurance was this week? The problem of legacy systems in the insurance industry, right? I've been very lucky. I had two heads of technology in my corporations. One was a woman by the name of Ellen Clancy, who really forced me into technology in a more meaningful way early on, and she was brilliant. And my wife. My wife worked and took a company that eventually went public, and she was the second employee in that company. And she's a brilliant technology person. She came back and did. We at Gramercy right now, and Matt and I speak about this all the time, we're data driven. We have more data today than ever before. We should make better decisions. We focus on how we report that data out to the operational units within the company, allowing us to do the due diligence that we can do. It can be of no value to me if I can't do that. I've concluded that. And we'll just touch real quickly on the AI thing, right? We will, as an industry, be more affected by AI because of that data-driven industry we're in. I view that in a very positive way. Let's forget about, I'm not a policymaker and building guidelines around AI, and we all everything I hear, you hear on television, you hear something around, if somebody can recreate me and put me over in Paris, France right now, and you'll think I'm there, that's a danger. But that's not what will happen. That's not what I'm worried about. I believe technology will have a positive impact on my companies in the future because it will free really smart people to focus on the things they can impact when it comes back. If we have to do you know in the law right now, if I take a deposition of you, I can use AI during that deposition to analyze your questions or your answers, point out to me in real time the inconsistencies, and feed to me in real time additional questions I should be asking you. Well, if I've got that, it leaves me free to do what I can do. and do a better job in that deposition. I don't have to worry. Wait a minute, did he just contradict himself, or do it? AI has just told me whether you did or not. And give me 5. So I think real quick, just we're going to be impacted by technology, by AI tremendously. I am looking forward to it. We will embrace it. We'll try to use it in a smart way. And always, 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 how will that allow the operational side of the house to perform on a higher level? And the last thing is, I will give you the third thing my mother taught me, and it'll be the last thing I'll leave you. So she taught me not to be afraid. She taught me nothing is impossible. But the third thing she taught me was when I was 7 years old. And we used to go every year to a family resort upstate New York, not far from Woodstock, New York. It was called Edgewater Farms. And we'd go there every year because when she was a little child in Queens, New York, she had a friend. Her name was Charlotte. And Charlotte had developed a respiratory condition, and medical profession, they suggested that the family take her upstate New York where the air was cleaner. So this New York City family moved upstate New York in an area called Hurley, New York, not far from Woodstock, and started a little business. If you look at the history of the Hudson Valley, there's a lot of historic names, but there are 3 prominent names. One is Van Rensselaer, one is Mackey, and the other is Hunt. And this little city girl grew up and met a man by the name of Lansing Hunt. At one time, his family owned thousands of farm acres in the Hudson Valley. And she married him, but she was from the city. And she turned part of this massive farm with this huge farmhouse into a family resort, a business. And it had a stream running through it that opened up into, when I was a little kid, I thought it was an ocean. It was a very large pond or a very small lake. And one morning, my mother walked me, this beautiful morning, no breeze or anything, down along the stream before breakfast to that pond or that small lake. And in that morning, with no breeze or anything, and nobody around, the water is like a mirror, right? It's just perfectly flat. And she picked a tiny stone up on the ground and she threw it out in that water. And she said, "Bill, what did you see happen there?" I know, I'm 7 years old. She just threw a pebble in the water. She said, "You saw that tiny little pebble hit that tiny little spot in that big body of water, and within seconds, the entire body of water was moving. You can make a difference." We think in this world, we're so small, and the world is so big and so complex. Sometimes people will get discouraged because they don't think they can make a difference. And that lesson, that each of us, in our own way, no matter how small we are, and how big a pond we exist in, we can make a difference. And that was the third thing she taught us.
Thank you. That was a great ending to it. But before we end this, I want to thank Khadija, Nicole,
Thank you.
and Gul for making this happen. Thank you for that.